Hey all you crafty witches, are you ready to have some fun today? This is Kari from StudioR12 Stencils and we have a great project for you. We're going to do layers, we are going to do plaid, we are going to do stripes, and you are going to learn a ton. Okay, let's get started. For today's surface, we are using an 1/8 inch Masonite pumpkin shape. A lot of times on our channel, you'll see us painting on 1/4 inch MDF. The Masonite and the MDF is a little bit different. The Masonite is a little bit smoother. It's obviously thinner, which makes it lighter so that on your walls, you might not have to use as many command strips, which is a nice touch. However, since it is smoother, we are going to take a little sandpaper to it before we get started, just so we can ensure that the paint will soak into the wood. When you are using your sandpaper on your surface, you want to make sure that you go in one direction. So you can either go vertical, you can go horizontal, whatever works best for you. And let me see if you can hear the difference in this. So this is the side I haven't done. It's very smooth. This side is a little bit toothier and grittier just with a couple swipes of the sandpaper. We do not often use a sealer before we paint when we are using MDF. However, if you want to, you certainly can. We like the DecoArt multi-purpose sealer. You will put some on your palette paper, put a layer on top of your surface, and then start your painting. So today we are doing a pumpkin. We have a really fun stencil that we are using. It is Crafty Witch. This is part of our new Halloween line for 2023. And then we are using our best-selling ever stencil, our Buffalo Plaid, to put a little border at the bottom. When we were looking at colors for doing this, white and black was very traditional, basic, and we loved it. However, we decided we wanted to add a little orange to it since we are painting on a pumpkin. So for our background, we are going to do the top portion as an orange pumpkin and the bottom portion as a black and white pattern pumpkin. Since we are using orange, we will put an undercoat, a base coat under the orange with paints like orange, reds, yellows, pink. Sometimes they don't offer a lot of coverage. So anytime we paint with those, we will always start with a gray. You don't have to pick a perfect gray every time. It can kind of depend on your project. We have a really light one chosen. We have a darker one chosen. I'm gonna go with the light because I'm going to paint over the whole project, and then I'm going to do white on the bottom and orange on the top. I could potentially just do the top portion as the gray and paint the orange over it, but I'm trying to have as few times that I have to tape off and measure as possible. So the color of this gray is number 2. If you have our paint color guide, we use Sherwin-Williams paint, but we have a fun paint color guide showing you what color of Sherwin-Williams we use, as well as the corresponding colors for DecoArt. And then we also have the hex code so you can look it up online. I am base coating this with our polyfoam brush, going in vertical strokes. Once again, you can do vertical, you can do horizontal. You'll want to go in the same direction that you sanded. When you get to the edges, you sweep away or you pull towards you, depending on which edge you are on. If you are on the edge and you are pulling on the far edge, you run the risk of getting paint on the edge of your surface. So with the teeny tiny surface, you might not have as much problem with that because there is less area for it to catch. However, with the 1/8 inch surface, you're also going to have a bigger issue of trying to clean up the surface edge with trying to get it back to painted black if you would want it black, because it is so thin. So keep that in mind. If you are painting on 1/8 inch, the thinner the surface, the more careful you'll want to be. So this is kind of wiggling around a little bit. We do run into that with the 1/8 inch surfaces because they are so light. So what we can do is we have a little towel from the Dollar Tree that we grabbed, and we use it on a lot of our projects. So it has paint all over it, and that's okay. We are just going to use it to help stabilize with this. So we have one layer of gray. I'm going to leave it at that just to have a little bit of a base coat before we get into our orange. I'm going to put my polyfoam in the water bucket. I'm grabbing my orange. For the orange, I'm doing a 56, and our white is a 27. I am going to start with my white first because it's going to be easier for me to paint the orange over top of the white if I happen to not get my lines perfectly centered, rather than to paint the white over top of the orange. So I'm going to go ahead while this is drying and kind of line up what I want to do with my project. So I have my Crafty Witch, and then I have my Buffalo Plaid, and I think I want to lift that up a little bit, put the F up into the stem. I want to have at least a couple rows. So one thing I do want to do with my Buffalo Plaid is I want the open squares to be my top row so that it does have a little more coverage along the top. Okay, so I think I want to go right here. So what I will do is I will get my triple thread Ghost Rider, and I'm going to make a little line here. And this is going to show me where I want to paint white versus where I want to go orange, because now I know where my Buffalo Plaid is going to start. You have a couple different options here. You can use tape, and you can tape down nice and straight where you want to go, depending on the surface. If you have a really large surface, using tape can get a little tricky because you have to be careful to make sure you get along that straight line. You could use a piece of palette paper here and use this as your straight line. I'm going to do that with this project just to show you a different way to do it. I'm going to tape my palette paper actually down to my towel, put it where I want it. I'm going to line it up just above the pencil mark that I made, so that I will paint over the pencil mark. And then I'm also going to tape it up here at the top. So you can tape down to your table or wherever. We don't want to tape on the surface because we're going to be painting on the surface. So I have another polyfoam brush. I'm going to go into my white because I want my white to be the base coat here at the bottom. And I'm going to start base coating. When you get to the area that your palette paper is at, to prevent bleeding under, you'll want to pull it towards you. If you push it, you can push the paint underneath that palette paper or tape or whatever you're using. I like the palette paper to do this because our stencils are laser cut. So I know this line is going to be very straight, and I don't have to worry about taping off very straight. I'm just very lightly sweeping up against that line. And then you will do this as many times as you want to get the amount of coat that you want. So we have a layer of gray paint, and then now we have one layer of white paint. And I'm going to blow dry this and then add a couple more layers so I get that nice white bold look. Okay, so we have our white base coat in. However, I made a couple mistakes because I wanted to show you some things that can cause mistakes and what you can do to fix them. So as we peel this back, you see that we do have a pretty nice straight white line. However, once you get close to it, we did have a couple little spots that bled under. This can be for a couple of reasons. There might have been too much paint on the foam brush when we were up against the edge. If you can see on my palette paper, I was aware of it being a little wet near the line. So I did offload a little bit with my poly foam brush before I went to my project. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Up along those edges, it's going to kind of be like stenciling. We like to go in light dusty layers to help prevent bleeding under. So anytime that there is an edge, you're going to want to offload so that you can get that nice clean edge. The second thing was that over on the left side of my project, it wasn't taped down super snug. So there was a little movement of my stencil. So with that, you can hold down the stencil or the mask or whatever you are using to help prevent it from moving. So just a couple little things. So then now as we move on, and we start to think ahead to our project, what we can do is know that once we come in here, we can line this up right against the edge and go ahead and paint it. And then if we're not happy with how that top edge looks, we can also add in a stripe across the top just to give us a bold black stripe across our buffalo plaid. So we'll keep that in mind as we move forward. So now we're going to do the opposite. And I'm going to actually turn my surface around for this just because I prefer to pull away from the mask rather than to push into it. So I'm going to go right over here along the edge, and I'm actually going to line up my mask a little bit underneath where that white line starts and try to be a little more diligent this time on getting that fine line with my orange. So we're going into the number 56. I am going to come over here and offload it a little bit. And this is also important when you are thinking about what colors you are going to do, especially if you're going to do something like a plaid. So as you are painting plaid, you will always want to think about what do you want your undercolor to be and what do you want your plaid color to be. A lot of times, more often than not, we will paint our base color a light color and then do our darker color on top as the plaid, because it is much easier to paint the darker plaid over the lighter base rather than vice versa. If you are doing the light over the dark, there is a chance you will have to do a layer of gray and then start with your light color over top of it so that you can get the coverage that you want and that you need. And sometimes the color just doesn't tend to pop as nicely when you are doing the lighter color over the darker color. Okay, it's time for the big reveal. We have our base coats done. We're going to pull off our piece of Mylar here, and we have our nice straight line across our pumpkin. So the beauty of stencils is that we have options in how we want to move forward with this. We are using the buffalo plaid along the bottom of our project. I want to show you a couple things about the buffalo plaid. So I grabbed this in 3 different sizes because I wanted to show you that with our stencils, they come in several different sizes over on StudioR12.com. But as we make our patterns and designs, the cutout portion of the stencil will grow. So we have a smaller buffalo plaid stencil here. And then you can see as it gets bigger, the squares of the buffalo plaid get bigger. And then our largest size has really big squares. So you do have some fun options when it comes to choosing which one you want to use on your project. I initially chose one that would cover most of my surface here, knowing that I was only going to do a bottom portion of it. However, now that I have it laid out, I think I like the smaller checks better because it is covering such a small area. So I'm going to go with our small size here. I do want the open squares on my top line, and I'm going to line this up right along the edge of where the black and orange meets. So you may have noticed as we're talking about this, lining up is kind of the key to today's project, right? There's a lot of lines, a lot of straight lines, a lot of eyeballing and covering. So there's a lot going on in today's project. And I am also going to tape a portion over here because if I don't, there is a chance that I will ghost. So ghosting is when you are painting and you accidentally get a little close to the edge of your stencil or to the edge of a line, and then it goes on the outside or goes to a portion where you don't want to go. There are ways to fix that. We do have videos on how to fix your stenciling mistakes. And so we do have some tips, but if we can prevent it, we're going to try. So now we're going into our black, which is our number 28. And now we are getting into stenciling. We love the dome-shaped brushes for stenciling. We have found with the flat brushes that it increases the chances of bleeding under because the bristles tend to push underneath the stencil. So we love the dome cut. Only a small portion of the brush is actually on your project when you are painting. We go into our paint and then we offload. So we bring it over to a paper towel and we get most of the paint off of our brush. When you take it to your hand, you want it to be a light dusty color. You can hardly see anything. You don't want it wet and goopy on your hand because if it's wet and goopy, it's going to be wet on your project and that's going to increase your chances of bleeding under. So stenciling is a layers game. So we come to our project and we are going to swirl. And you can see that this is very light and dusty. There's not a lot of paint. It just looks really, really, really light. So how can you tell if you have too much paint on your brush when you go to your project? One way to tell is if you have swirl marks. So this is our swirling motion. We're applying a really small amount of pressure. We're not really pushing here. But if you start painting on your project and there's swirl marks, that is an indication that there is too much paint on your brush. Something to keep in mind, our stencil is bigger than our surface. So it's kind of laying over here, maybe even pushing up a little bit. You'll want to hold on to that stencil when you are coming around the bottom. You can also find another surface that is this height and put underneath the bottom portion of your stencil here so that your stencil lays flat. So you have a couple of different options there. Since we are doing light and dusty layers, it is already dry now that I come back to do my second layer. So we put more paint on, we load more paint off, and then we continue to swirl until we get the darkness that we want on our project. So now that we have 2 layers done, I am going to peel this back a little and peek. And because we've done light dusty layers, we do not have any bleeding under, which is lovely. That's the worst nightmare, especially when you're painting something like buffalo plaid, because if you have these teeny tiny lines and then you have a mess, yes, we can clean it up, but it is going to be a little more tricky because there are so many areas. All right, so we're gonna do one more layer and see where that takes us. And in this layer, I'm going to show you what it looks like to stipple. So this is a stippling motion, a tapping motion. This is what a lot of stencilers do. This is going to be personal preference as to what application method you like, the swirl or the stipple. We prefer the swirl because it helps with the pressure that we need to prevent bleeding under. When you stipple, you apply more pressure. And then you also are pushing the paint up into your brush. So there is more paint in the brush. The brush stays a little more wet, which also increases your chances of bleeding under. Now, the stipple does give us a bolder look, but you can still achieve that by your swirling. It just might take a couple of extra layers of swirling to get there. Patty only swirls. She does not like stippling at all. I will occasionally stipple on the last coat of my project or the last couple of coats, depending on what look I'm going for. If I'm going for a rustic country look and I want it to be a little distressed, I never stipple. However, if I am using black or red and I want it to be really bold, then I will typically stipple on my last couple of layers. But I also am aware that I might have a little more cleanup to do if I'm stippling. So we stippled half of this. I'm going to swirl the other half so you can see the difference in coverage. One thing I did not do was blow dry this between my layers. So sometimes you might not have to, sometimes you might. My project is still a little wet, and I know that because I'm getting a little bit of a hole dug here. So my black paint was still a little wet when I went back to swirl. So let's pull this back and take a look. So you can see the portion that we stippled is a little more bold. The portion that we swirled is a little less. However, doing a couple more layers of the swirling will get you where you are with the stippling. Okay, so we have our layers here. We are going to peel it back, and we're going to peel it back carefully because we do have some wet paint. So now to finish off our buffalo plaid, we need to move our stencil over. However, you cannot do that while there's wet paint on your project. You're gonna smear your paint everywhere, and that would be really sad with all of these bold colors. So we are going to get the blow dryer, make sure this is nice and dry before we move anything. So now this is nice and dry, and we are going to move our stencil over. And one benefit of moving it is that you do have the lines. So now we can line it up with our other portions. You will want to keep your eye on the direction of your stencil when you are using pattern stencils. We have a very small etch mark in the bottom right corner of all of our stencils saying that you got it from StudioR12.com and what the SKU is. We always try to keep that in that bottom right corner so that we know when we're moving it around, if that's in the bottom right corner, that that's the right spot and the stencil's in the right direction. You could also mark the stencil with a marker and put a T for top and a B for bottom, or put little colored pink or green marks so that you know, but you do want to keep your stencil in the same direction as you're painting so that you don't have wonky patterns. Okay, so our buffalo plaid looks amazing. I'm super happy with it. Let me get this dry and I'll show you how to add a band here. We have a ton of striped stencils. So a couple of years ago, we went to market in Atlanta to shop for our little boutique and then to find some design ideas to see what is trending and what we need to be making for our stencil fans. And tea towel stripes were everywhere. And a couple of years later, they are still everywhere. They are like the piece de resistance to all of home decor and crafting and art. So we have several different stripes. You can get them in one sheet in several different sizes, and the stripes grow as the sizes grow, or you can get them in cut sheets. So sometimes we like to have them cut just because they're a little more easier to manage. One thing I do like to do when I'm using stripes is to find one that is big enough to cover my whole surface. So we did a little moving around when we were painting our buffalo plaid, but with my stripe, I grabbed one that was a little bit bigger than my surface, because when you are painting a stripe, you will have to be careful when you come to the edge of the stripe. So if the stripe was here and we came to the edge, one, you're going to have to line it up perfectly again. And two, if you paint all the way to the edge of the stripe, you're gonna get a really hard line that's really hard to blend in when you move on. Okay, so I want this stripe just to be a little bit over my buffalo plaid. All right, so I'm gonna check this now that I came here. Now, I'm also going to put a piece of tape through this second band down here to once again prevent any ghosting. And I'm actually not taping it through my project. I'm just taping it to the stencil itself so that it doesn't potentially pull up any paint. That's one of the things when using tape on your projects is that if you have fresh paint, there is the potential that that tape is going to pull up the paint. So we have our band here. I am going to stipple. When you have long lines like this one, we like to use the stippling motion. With our little lines like with the buffalo plaid, because the holes are so teeny tiny, you can still swirl. But with long lines like this, if you swirl, you do increase your chances of bleeding under because there's not a bridge here and there's a little more room for that stencil to pull away. But we're still getting lots and lots of paint off of this brush. If you are using the same brush for most of your project like I am, I've only needed one dome brush today. However, I'm getting a lot of paint in my brush because I have used it over and over and over again. I have swirled, I have stippled. It might be a good time to grab a new brush before we head on to our final piece of our stenciling, just to give ourselves a little grace when it comes to bleeding under, not bleeding under. I'm going to blow dry and then we'll get a couple more layers on here and make it nice and bold. So we have this stripe done. I'm gonna go ahead and throw this in the bucket and we'll use a fresh one for the rest of our project. So I am going to very slowly peel this off. And then now we have a little stripe. I'm super happy with that. Let's go into our final piece. And this is the easy part. This is our final stencil, which is our main design. So this would be super cute just to leave it like this. You can add a little bow on it. You can maybe put a monogram on it, throw a little leaf on here or something. But I really love this crafty witch. I'm not going to paint everything that's on here. I am only going to paint the words, which is another fun thing about stenciling is that you have endless options because you could paint this and make it really Halloween, or you can just paint the words and make it just a cute little piece for your craft room. I am going to grab the T-square. I do want my F kind of up in the stem of the pumpkin, but I do need to see how that plays out with measurements to see if that's actually going to work for me. So my C is just a little 2 inches over 2 inches in. My Y is just a little over 2 inches in. So I think if I move this just a little more to my left, and then I'm able to line up the bottom here with our line. Since we used a stencil to make that line, we know that it's nice and straight. And so now we are good to go. Grab a couple pieces of tape, just being very careful not to put too much pressure here along the sides. I am going to grab a multi-masker for this. So since we are only painting the words, I do not want the stars, I do not want the hat. We got tired of taping off projects like this, where we didn't want maybe some of the extra flourishes. And it takes a lot of tape, it takes a lot of time away from your painting. So we made the StudioR12 Multimasker, and it has a bunch of fun different shapes. And what you will do is you will set it down on your stencil when you are getting close to parts. So I will move this around as I paint to help prevent me getting those areas where I don't actually want the paint. I am using a 5/8 inch dome brush on this project. This is the largest dome brush in our set. We have teeny tiny ones that are really good for teeny things. If I was painting the stars or the little dots, this is a really great brush. Most of the time we are using the 5/8 brush because we are wanting to cover a lot of ground in a little bit of time. So once again, we are putting paint onto our brush. We are offloading, and then we are coming straight to our project, moving this multi-masker around, just applying a little teeny bit of pressure, being mindful that we're not trying to cover too much ground on this project in a quick amount of time, because it could get us in trouble with not realizing that we're painting some of the spots we don't want to paint. And if you do accidentally do them, it's not a big deal if you catch it quick. So here, I just got a little piece of this hat. Let me finish my T and my Y. Sometimes I talk and don't pay attention. So I've been talking about making mistakes quite a bit. So now I need to tell you how to fix them. This is our click eraser. It is a PVC eraser. And when you just use it on your project, nothing happens. However, when you put it in water and then dab a little bit off and then come into your project, you can erase what you have accidentally done. So I'm going to come over here and once again use my wet eraser and slightly do this. And this is only going to work within a couple of minutes of you painting before the paint cures. So that is one reason to make sure that you are doing your peeking, and you don't want to put your stencil down until your project is dry. All right, now we can move on. Now we know with this stencil, we need to pay closer attention. So let's talk about stippling here. This might be a good time to stipple with this stencil because there are so many places to potentially ghost or make mistakes where we don't want them, that with your stippling, you're not taking up so much space and being so flowy. So stippling might be a good idea here, just to keep our brush and our stencil where we want it. Just know that you will have to do a little extra offloading to prevent bleeding under. And now I'm really glad that since we have noticed this, that I did get a new brush for doing this, because having that brush with all the paint in it from all of our previous stippling would possibly make for a messy situation with this part. When you get our multi-masker, know that it is washable. It is just like our stencils. So our stencils are 7.5 mil Mylar. It is thick enough so that it is strong for you, but it is thin enough so that when you are painting, you aren't getting a lot of ridges because the stencil is so thick. And it is reusable. It is washable, so you can use it over and over again. We have videos on how to clean your stencils the correct way. There are some great tips in that video, including how to clean your stencil if you use red paint, which you will want to know. You are going to be very sad if you use your stencil and you use red paint, and then the next time you use it, there's a white background, and then you might end up with a little bit of pink on your project. That has happened to us, we know. So we make all the silly goose mistakes so that we can teach you what not to do. We also have a Mylar palette that we use for our paint. At one time, we were using palette paper and we loved it. However, we weren't able to get it anymore. So we were trying to decide what we were going to use as our palette. And we have used paper plates. We've used all kinds of different things. And one day we grabbed a piece of Mylar, and now we only use Mylar as our palette, and we love it. It is great for mixing. It is washable and it is reusable so that you can use it over and over again. And you can purchase them in one set. So they come in these nice long pieces like we used earlier for our masker. So you could use that as a long mask, or you could use it and cut it up for pieces of palette. You can get it in one, or you can get it in packs of 5. And we really love them. Are we ready for the big reveal? We're going to peel the stencil back and voila, look how cute. It's nice and bold. We were able to clean up all of our mistakes. However, now that I take this off, I'm kind of bummed. I wish I would have thought of it earlier. How cute would this have been to put some little white polka dots in the background? So then you'll have your plaid and your polka dot. So those are things that you might not think of until after. You could still do it and use your masker to mask off the areas where you don't want the polka dots to be, or you could even start fresh, base coat the orange, and then do your polka dots and then paint over if you wanted a more layered look. I am going to use a really, really fine grit sandpaper just to go over my project, and I'm going to do it in the same direction that I did when I started. I am going to remove this towel because it keeps getting stuck. Just do it nice and light, and you will want to check your sandpaper before you use them. It looks like I had a little bit of white paint on here, so now my black has a little bit of white through it just from where that was. So it's not necessarily as bold as what it was. If you don't like that and you run into a mistake like that, you can go back and just paint one more layer and make it nice and bold, or be mindful to put on a new sandpaper every time you go. But I love how this little guy turned out. If you would want, you could use a polyurethane varnish, or you could also use a natural wax. So what that wax is going to do is it's going to give it that really nice, soft feeling. We keep a sponge in ours and we just put it on this sponge. Probably should use gloves for this. And then just wipe it back and forth on your project. It does not take long. And then once it cures, give it a day or so, and then it'll be protected. So not only will it be finished, but also when you are storing these, since this is going to be a fall Halloween project, when you store it with all of your other fall and Halloween decorations, your paint is protected until you get it out for next season. If you liked what we did here, don't forget to subscribe to our StudioR12 Stencils YouTube channel. Check out the playlist with our other Halloween and fall crafts. And don't forget to check out StudioR12.com. Grab yourself some stencils and paint along with us.